Malubiting is a massive, stunning, and jagged peak which is located in an extremely remote region within the Karakoram Range in Pakistan. Standing at a height of 7,458 meters at its summit, Malubiting is the 58th highest mountain in the world. However, despite its impressive height, Malubiting has remained relatively unknown. Even to spell check, apparently, that doesn't happen often, which is largely due to its very remote location. Even within the mountaineering community, the peak has relished in relative obscurity, as it has been largely overlooked by most climbers within the sport throughout the years. However, while the number of ascent attempts of Malubiting throughout mountaineering's history can be counted on one's hands, and the number of successful ascents of the peak on just one hand, Malubiting's remote location is not primarily why the peak has been largely avoided by most mountaineers throughout the years. In fact, the peak's remoteness is simply another further factor that only adds to the high difficulty of ascending the peak, which is described as immensely dangerous with difficult technical climbing throughout the ascent from all its faces. And unlike with most mountains, the theoretical, least technically difficult route of ascent isn't really apparent at a glance, which led to many of the first attempted ascents of the peak following vastly different routes on several different faces. Additionally, with difficult climbing conditions on its slopes, the trek of approximately 50 kilometers to reach base camp can wear down climbers beforehand, and with finite supplies, the window to make a push safely while allowing for weather and routing is much tighter than with many other ascents, further adding to the commitment required to make an attempt at reaching Malubiting's summit. Furthermore, the conditions found on the mountain slopes are slick and unrelenting, as Malubiting is caked in thick ice that forms massive, overhanging seracs, which regularly shed huge chunks of ice, which cascade down its slopes and form massive avalanches that sweep up everything in their paths. Additionally, layers of snow deposited atop these massive, crevassed layers of ice caked atop Malubiting's granite frame often form large cornices along its steep ridges, which threaten to send unwitting summit hopefuls that mistake them for solid ground, plummeting through them into their deaths below. And with all these aforementioned hazards combined with the remote location of Malubiting, there is little hope for summit hopefuls of rescue if stricken while on the mountain, as well as even if a potential rescue party could be organized quickly, the logistics of performing a successful rescue would be very complex and potentially extremely dangerous to the rescuers as well. So it is safe to say that climbers that attempt to summit the peak are even more on their own than on the slopes of most peaks. The first, ultimately unsuccessful attempted ascent of Malubiting would take place in the year 1955, and the peak would see several subsequent first ascent attempts over the following decades, with a single summit team attempting the ascent in 1958, 1959, and 1968, and by the year 1969, the peak would remain unclimbed, as a team consisting of 8 British climbers named Brian Cosby, Brian Ripley, Tom Waghorn, John Allen, Arthur Clarke, Oliver Woolcock, Ian Bell, and Ian Grant would depart Manchester, England on June 1st, 1969, as they began their long and arduous expedition to the slopes of Malubiting. Traveling to the region by land, The expedition team would reach the town of Rawalpindi later that month on June 26th, where they would meet with their Pakistani liaison officer, who was required to accompany the climbers on their journey, and made their way to the remote town of Sasli on July 6th. Notably, before arriving in Pakistan, even before their journey had begun, the mountaineers had been dealt a blow when they were granted permission to climb the peak from its south side and not from the north as they had initially requested. Upon their arrival in Sasli, the team was beset with yet more logistical issues, as the 70 porters they had hired to help them haul the massive amount of supplies they needed to make an ascent attempt on such an isolated peak were now demanding a higher rate of pay than they had originally agreed upon, and so, after some failed negotiations, the British expedition team would eventually fire these porters and hired another group of 70 porters to haul their gear instead, and set off on the long march towards Malubiting slopes. However, the British climbers would lament the slow speed that their new porters were traveling at, and would grow increasingly frustrated as the porters would frequently force them to stop with strikes for higher pay along the way, and they would finally establish their base camp at an altitude of 12,900 feet, which was lower than they had initially planned to, due to yet another strike by porters on July 16th. The expedition team would then set to work scouting their potential route to the summit over the course of 4 reconnaissance climbs over the following few days, but despite their efforts, the team were unsure which potential approach to reach the summit appeared to be the most doable, and they eventually settled on a longer, more horizontal route up the Baskei Glacier, which appeared, at least from what they could gather, to be the least risky ascent approach. The team would then set to work establishing their camps along this route, placing their Camp 1 at an altitude of 14,200 feet on July 20th, and their Camp 2 at an altitude of 16,200 feet over the course of July 23rd and 24th. They would then go on to establish their Camp 3 at an altitude of 18,000 feet on July 28th. However, by the next day, half of the members of the expedition team had now been sidelined by a bacterial illness, as the remainder of the climbers continued to push for progress up Malubiting's deadly and unforgiving slopes. On July 29th, 1969, John Allen and Brian Ripley would depart Camp 3 as they began to ascend further up the mountain in search for a suitable location for their Camp 4, and by the early afternoon, the two men had located a spot at an altitude of 19,500 feet and began their descent back towards Camp 3 at 18,000 feet. However, as they were making their descent, the climbers dislodged a loose block of ice, which struck Brian Ripley and sent him plummeting approximately 2,500 feet down Malubiting's steep face towards their lower camps to his death below. John would relay the bad news of Brian Ripley's death to the remainder of the summit team. However, despite only 2 climbers in the team remaining in condition to make a bid for the summit, as Ian Bell had injured his back, the remaining 2 climbers would continue to push for the summit over the next few days. However, as they ascended, they found that the climbing conditions on the peak were only increasingly brutal in their difficulty as they ascended, and on August 3rd, with their morale thoroughly shattered, the remaining members of the team would officially abandon their efforts and made their way towards Alum Bridge to relay the news of Brian Ripley's death and their failure to ascend Malubiting to the outside world. Upon their arrival at the bridge, the 7 surviving climbers were all in poor physical condition and required hospitalization as, along with the injured Bell and the 4 worseningly sick climbers, John Allen was severely dehydrated and subsequently spent a week in a hospital in Gilgit recovering from the brutal climb. This unfortunate unsuccessful summit attempt would not mark the last unsuccessful attempt or death while doing so at reaching Malubiting Summit before it was successfully accomplished in 1971. However, this 1969 summit attempt truly goes to show how impressive the first successful ascent truly was, as the myriad of logistical issues they faced, combined with illness and unpredictable dangers along untreaded routes, on top of the demanding, highly technical climbing conditions, truly stacked their attempt against them from the start. Malubiting has only been successfully summited once since the first ascent in 1971 in the year 1997, following the 1971 team's route to the summit. Thank you all for watching.